Kenny Reeves strolled down a quiet street in Los Angeles. It was one of those rare evenings when life felt calm, free from the constant hum of cameras and flashing lights. He enjoyed these moments, blending into the crowd like an ordinary man. The city felt peaceful tonight, until he noticed the dog. At first he thought it was just a coincidence. A scruffy, medium-sized dog with a wiry coat ambled along behind him. Its fur was dark brown, with streaks of black around the face that gave it a sharp, almost wolf-like appearance. Kenny ignored it, continuing his walk, but when he stopped to tie his shoe, the dog stopped too. When he turned a corner, the dog turned with him. Its quiet persistence was unnerving. Kenny glanced back. The dog wasn't close enough to seem threatening, but its steady pace and fixed gaze felt deliberate. "Lost, buddy?" Kenny muttered, crouching slightly. The dog didn't bark or wag its tail. It simply stared, its head tilted as if studying him. Shaking his head, Kenny continued home. He lived in a secluded property surrounded by high walls and dense trees, far from the noise of the city. By the time he reached his gate, the dog was still there. It sat just a few feet away, its eyes locked onto him. "All right, this is getting weird," Kenny muttered, half laughing. He opened the gate and stepped inside, expecting the dog to wander off. Instead, it sat down at the edge of the property, as if guarding the entrance. Kenny stood by the window that night, looking out into the darkness. The dog hadn't moved. It sat in the same spot, silent and still, its silhouette barely visible under the dim streetlights. He tried to shrug it off and went to bed, but an uneasy feeling lingered. The next morning, Kenny was surprised to see the dog still there. Its fur looked rougher in the daylight, like it had spent years fending for itself on the streets. Yet it didn't seem weak. There was a sharpness in its movements, a sense of purpose. Kenny opened the gate and approached it cautiously. "All right, buddy. If you're sticking around, you're going to need food." He tossed the dog a piece of bread from his breakfast plate. The dog sniffed it briefly before eating, its movements quick but controlled. After a moment, the dog looked up at him, ears twitching. Then it barked, short and sharp, a single warning sound. Kenny frowned. "What now?" he asked, turning to follow the dog's gaze. That's when he noticed the broken glass glinting on the pathway near his foot. He stepped back, narrowly avoiding it. "Ha, good catch," he muttered, glancing at the dog. It had already resumed its position, sitting calmly by the gate like nothing had happened. The day passed without incident. Kenny went about his errands, driving into the city for meetings and a quick workout at his favorite gym. Yet as he stepped out of the building, there it was again, the same dog sitting quietly by his car. "Seriously?" he muttered, half expecting to wake up from some strange dream. He approached the dog and bent down. "You got to have a home somewhere. Do you? Or are you my new shadow?" The dog didn't flinch. Its eyes, intelligent and piercing, stayed fixed on his face. For the first time, Kenny felt a chill, not fear, but a strange sense of connection, like the dog knew him. With a resigned sigh, he opened his car door. "All right, get in." To his surprise, the dog hopped in without hesitation, settling into the passenger seat like it belonged there. As Kenny drove home, he glanced at the dog. It didn't sniff around or fidget like most strays. Instead, it sat perfectly still, watching the road ahead. The unease from the night before crept back into his mind. By the time they reached his house, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the property. Kenny opened the gate, and the dog jumped out, walking ahead of him like it already knew the place. "You act like you've been here before," Kenny muttered. The dog turned its head briefly, almost like it understood. Kenny decided to let it stay for the night. He filled a bowl with water and found some leftover chicken, setting it down outside the back door. The dog ate quietly, never begging for more or showing any typical animal greed. Its behavior was too precise, too controlled. Later that night, Kenny sat on his couch, scrolling through his phone. The dog lay outside, curled up near the door. Occasionally, it would lift its head and look around, its ears twitching at the faintest sounds. Kenny couldn't shake the feeling that this dog wasn't here by chance. It had followed him, warned him, and now it was guarding his home. Who or what had sent it? For the first time in years, Kenny felt like the calm, predictable flow of his life had been disrupted, and deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Kenny Reeves stepped outside to collect his mail. The fresh air was still and quiet, but the strange dog was still there, sitting in the exact same spot near the gate. It looked as if it hadn't moved all night. Its eyes, sharp and focused, followed him with eerie precision. "All right, buddy," Kenny said, approaching cautiously. "You've officially outstayed your welcome. You don't look like a stray, but you're definitely not acting like a regular dog." The dog tilted its head, as if weighing its options. Kenny sighed, grabbed a slice of bread from his breakfast plate, and tossed it over the gate. The dog caught it midair with an agility that startled him. "Not bad," he muttered. As Kenny turned to walk back inside, the dog let out a sharp bark. It wasn't a normal bark. It was short and deliberate, more like a warning. Startled, Kenny turned to see the dog's gaze fixed on something near the edge of the driveway. He followed its line of sight and froze. There, just a few feet ahead, was a small pool of motor oil on the concrete. His car, parked on the incline, had begun to shift ever so slightly backward. The parking brake must have failed. Kenny rushed forward, throwing himself into the car and yanking the emergency brake just as the vehicle inched closer to rolling down the hill. Heart racing, he looked back at the dog, now standing alert, tail stiff. "Did you just warn me?" Kenny muttered, stepping out of the car. The dog returned to its calm, seated position, watching him like a silent guardian. Later that day, Kenny decided to head into the city. He figured the dog would lose interest and wander off eventually. As he pulled out of the driveway, the dog trotted alongside the car for a moment before stopping near the gate. Kenny glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it watching him leave. "Stay put," he said under his breath, though he doubted the dog could hear him. Kenny's day was uneventful. He wrapped up a meeting, grabbed a coffee, and stopped by a bookstore to pick up a novel he'd been meaning to read. It wasn't until he stepped out of the cafe that his day took a turn. There it was again, the dog. It sat calmly on the sidewalk across the street, blending into the crowd of pedestrians. At first, Kenny thought it might be a coincidence, but as he walked toward his car, the dog followed, keeping its distance but never losing sight of him. "This is getting ridiculous," Kenny muttered. "Are you stalking me now?" He stopped by the car and turned to face the dog. "Look, I don't know what your deal is, but you can't keep following me. I'm not taking you home." The dog didn't respond, of course. It simply stared at him, its intelligent eyes unwavering. Kenny shook his head, muttering something about needing a break from the bazaar, and got into his car. As he started the engine, the dog barked again, a single urgent bark. Kenny frowned and looked around. A split second later, a delivery truck roared down the wrong side of the street, narrowly missing his car as it swerved to avoid another vehicle. Kenny's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He glanced at the dog through the windshield. It hadn't moved, its sharp gaze fixed on him as though it had known the truck was coming. When Kenny finally returned home, the dog was already waiting for him. It had somehow beaten him there, sitting by the gate like a sentinel. Kenny parked his car and approached it slowly. "All right, I get it. You're not just some random stray. But what are you?" he asked, crouching down to look the dog in the eyes. It stared back, calm and steady, as if it had all the answers and Kenny was the one asking the wrong questions. He decided to let the dog inside the gate this time. "You've earned a meal, at least." The dog followed him without hesitation, walking with a quiet confidence that unsettled Kenny. It didn't sniff around or act like most animals in a new environment. Instead, it sat down by the front door and watched him as if waiting for instructions. That night, Kenny couldn't shake the feeling that the dog wasn't here by chance. Every move it made seemed calculated, purposeful, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't entirely in control of what was happening in his own life. Kenny Reeves wasn't the kind of man to ignore a mystery, and this dog was quickly becoming one he couldn't put aside. After 2 days of strange behavior, it was clear this wasn't just an ordinary stray. As he fed the dog that morning, his eyes fell on its collar. It was old and worn, but still intact. There was no tag, only a faintly engraved symbol that looked almost mechanical in design. Kenny grabbed his phone and snapped a photo of it, intending to look it up later. "Let's see if you have an owner," he muttered. But deep down, he doubted this dog had one. It felt more like the dog had chosen him. Later that day, Kenny took the photo to a friend who was an expert in all things tech. "What do you make of this?" he asked, sliding his phone across the table. His friend frowned, enlarging the image. "This isn't just a regular design. It looks like a custom insignia. Definitely not store-bought." Kenny leaned in, intrigued. "You think it means something?" "I'd bet on it. This looks military, almost, or something private. You might want to be careful, Kenny." That wasn't exactly the reassurance he was hoping for. Kenny returned home, his mind buzzing with questions. The dog greeted him at the gate as usual, but this time Kenny couldn't shake the feeling that it was guarding him. As the evening wore on, Kenny did some research on the symbol. It didn't take long to find vague references to a group called Sentinel Labs. They were rumored to be involved in experimental technology, some of it involving animals. Kenny felt a chill run down his spine. "All right, buddy," he said, looking at the dog lying by the fireplace. "What exactly are you? And why are you here?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but as Kenny stared at it, he realized something unsettling. This wasn't just a pet. It was something far more deliberate. Kenny Reeves drove home, his mind churning with questions about the strange dog that had now become a part of his daily life. The cryptic symbol on its collar, the strange warnings, and the way it always seemed one step ahead. It was too much to ignore. But for all this curiosity, he couldn't shake the feeling that letting the dog into his life might have consequences. It was late evening, and the road leading to his house was empty. The gentle hum of his car engine was the only sound. Kenny glanced in his rearview mirror out of habit and frowned. A dark SUV had been trailing him for the past mile, its headlights a little too close for comfort. Just another car, he muttered to himself, though his grip on the steering wheel tightened. He slowed down slightly, hoping the vehicle would pass him, but it didn't. Instead, it maintained its distance, mirroring his speed. Kenny's instincts kicked in. Years of working in action films had given him an appreciation for danger, and this felt too deliberate to ignore. He decided to test his theory and took a sudden right turn onto a smaller road. The SUV followed without hesitation. "All right," Kenny said under his breath, his calm demeanor giving way to unease. This just got interesting. As the road narrowed, Kenny searched for an opportunity to lose the SUV. Up ahead, he spotted a side road leading into a wooded area. He made a sharp turn, tires screeching against the asphalt. The SUV hesitated for a moment before following. Kenny sped up, his heart pounding. The woods were dark, the trees casting long shadows that danced in his headlights. The road twisted and turned, but the SUV stayed close behind. It was clear now he was being chased. Just as he rounded a corner, something darted into the road ahead. Kenny slammed on the brakes, his car skidding to a stop. The dog was there, standing in the middle of the road, its eyes glowing faintly in the headlights. "What the how did you?" Kenny barely had time to process the sight when the SUV roared up behind him. The vehicle stopped abruptly, and two masked figures stepped out. "Step out of the car, Reeves," one of them shouted, his voice cold and authoritative. Kenny's mind raced. The dog stood firm, growling low and steady. The masked men seemed hesitant to approach it. Kenny took the opportunity to grab a tire iron from his passenger seat. "Not exactly the welcome wagon I was expecting," he said, stepping out cautiously. The first man lunged, but before he could get close, the dog sprang into action. It moved like lightning, leaping onto the man and knocking him to the ground. The second man hesitated, clearly unsure how to handle this unexpected turn. Kenny didn't wait. He swung the tire iron, catching the second man in the leg. The attacker stumbled, and Kenny pushed him back, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The dog, meanwhile, had incapacitated the first man. It stood over him, snarling, its teeth bared. The masked attackers, clearly outmatched, scrambled back to their SUV and sped off, leaving Kenny and the dog alone in the dark woods. Kenny leaned against his car, catching his breath. The dog approached him, its demeanor calm again, as if nothing had happened. "You just saved my life," Kenny said, staring at the dog in disbelief. "But how did you know?" The dog didn't respond, of course. It simply wagged its tail once, a brief acknowledgement before trotting back to the car. Kenny shook his head and got back behind the wheel. His quiet life had officially been turned upside down. Back at home, Kenny sat at his kitchen table, staring at the dog, which lay curled up by the door. The night's events replayed in his mind. The masked men, the dog's calculated attack, it all pointed to one thing. Someone wanted this dog, and they were willing to go through him to get it. Kenny retrieved the dog's collar and examined the strange symbol again. He grabbed his laptop and typed Sentinel Labs into a search engine. The results were sparse, just a few vague mentions of a private organization rumored to specialize in experimental technology. After digging through several forums, he found a thread on an obscure website. It described Sentinel Labs as a shadowy group known for conducting experiments on animals. The goal? To create enhanced creatures capable of intelligence far beyond anything nature intended. Some called them protectors, others called them weapons. Kenny leaned back in his chair, the weight of the information sinking in. "So you're one of theirs," he said, glancing at the dog. "But why are you here? Did you escape? Or were you sent to me?" The dog lifted its head, its eyes meeting his. For a moment, Kenny felt as if it understood every word. The next day, Kenny decided to seek help. He drove to a friend's workshop, Jared, a tech genius who specialized in reverse engineering anything unusual. "Jared, I need you to look at something," Kenny said, sliding the dog's collar across the table. Jared examined it closely, his brow furrowing. "This isn't just a regular collar," Jared said. "There's tech embedded in this. Tiny circuits, maybe even a chip. Where did you get this?" "It's a long story," Kenny replied. "Can you figure out what it does?" Jared nodded and got to work, carefully dismantling the collar under a magnifying glass. After an hour, he found a small chip hidden beneath the leather. "This isn't just a tracker," he said. "It's encrypted data, high-level stuff." Kenny frowned. "Can you crack it?" Jared hesitated. "I'll need time, and it might draw attention. If this is from who I think it is, they don't mess around." "Do it," Kenny said firmly. "Whatever's on that chip, I need to know." That night, Kenny returned home with the dog, his mind heavy with questions. As he stepped inside, the dog immediately went to the window, its ears twitching. Kenny followed its gaze and saw a car parked down the street, its engine idling. "They're watching us," Kenny muttered. The dog let out a low growl, its stance tense and ready. Kenny closed the blinds and locked the doors. Whatever was happening, he was now in the middle of something far bigger than he'd ever imagined, and he had a feeling it was only going to get worse. The atmosphere in Kenny's house was tense. The dog sat by the window, its ears twitching at the faintest sounds from outside. Kenny paced the living room, his mind racing. The SUV from the ambush, the encrypted chip in the collar, and the car idling down the street all pointed to one thing: Sentinel Labs wanted the dog back, and they weren't playing games. Kenny grabbed a backpack and began packing essentials. "All right, buddy," he said to the dog. "If they're watching us, we can't stay here." The dog tilted its head, watching him with calm intensity. Kenny stuffed clothes, a flashlight, and a few tools into the bag. He slipped a knife into his boot and grabbed his car keys. "Let's go." The streets were quiet as Kenny drove through Los Angeles, the dog sitting alert in the passenger seat. He took a long, winding route to throw off anyone who might be following. Every few minutes, he checked the rearview mirror, but there were no signs of pursuit. After an hour, Kenny pulled into an old motel on the outskirts of the city. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the parking lot. It wasn't glamorous, but it would do. Kenny paid in cash and led the dog into the room. The room was small and shabby, with peeling wallpaper and a lingering smell of mildew. Kenny locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. The dog immediately began sniffing around, checking every corner of the room. "You really are something else," Kenny muttered, watching it work. He sat down on the bed and pulled out his phone. Jared had promised to contact him once he cracked the encryption on the chip, but so far there was no word. Hours passed. Kenny lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while the dog stayed near the door, listening intently. Just as he began to drift off, the dog let out a low growl. Kenny shot up. "What is it?" The dog moved to the window, its body tense. Kenny peered outside and froze. A black SUV was parked across the street, its headlights off, but its engine running. "Damn it," Kenny muttered. He grabbed his bag and motioned to the dog. "Time to go." Kenny and the dog slipped out the back door of the motel, staying in the shadows. They made their way through a narrow alley and into the neighboring lot. Kenny kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone following them. As they reached his car, the dog stopped suddenly and growled again. Kenny turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows, a gun glinting in their hand. "Stay right there," the man said, his voice cold and commanding. "Hand over the dog, and no one gets hurt." Kenny raised his hands, playing for time. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but I think you've got the wrong guy." The man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "We know exactly who you are, Reeves. The dog isn't yours. It belongs to us." Before Kenny could respond, the dog lunged. It moved so fast that the man barely had time to react. The gun went off, the shot ringing out in the still night, but the dog had already knocked the man to the ground. Kenny grabbed the gun and tossed it away, pinning the man down. "Who sent you?" Kenny demanded, his voice low and furious. The man glared at him. "You don't know what you're dealing with. That dog is more dangerous than you think." Kenny tightened his grip. "Try me." The man smirked but said nothing. Kenny glanced at the dog, which was now standing over the man, growling softly. "Let him go," Kenny said, stepping back. The man scrambled to his feet and disappeared into the darkness. As they drove away, Kenny couldn't shake the man's words. More dangerous than you think. What had Sentinel Labs done to this dog, and why was it so important? The dog sat quietly in the passenger seat, its gaze fixed on the road ahead. Kenny glanced at it and sighed. "I don't know what's going on, buddy, but I'm starting to think you're the only one who can handle it." The next morning, Kenny received a call from Jared. "I cracked it," his friend said. "The encryption on the chip. It's linked to something called Project Sentinel." Kenny frowned. "What's Project Sentinel?" "It's bad news," Jared replied. "From what I've pieced together, it's a program to create enhanced animals, hyper-intelligent, highly trained, and capable of predicting human behavior. Your dog? It's a prototype." Kenny felt a chill run down his spine. "So it's a weapon." "Not exactly," Jared said. "More like a protector. It's designed to guard high-value targets. But here's the thing. The chip contains data that Sentinel Labs doesn't want anyone to see. Blueprints, research, maybe even blackmail material. Whoever controls the dog controls that data." Kenny's grip tightened on the phone. "Why me? Why did it come to me?" "No idea," Jared said. "But if they're after you, it means the dog chose you for a reason." With Jared's help, Kenny traced the origin of the chip to an abandoned lab outside the city. The lab, once a state-of-the-art facility, had been shut down years ago under mysterious circumstances. Kenny and the dog arrived at the lab late that evening. The building was in ruins, its walls covered in graffiti and its windows shattered. But as they stepped inside, Kenny felt a strange sense of foreboding. The air was thick with dust and decay, but the dog moved forward confidently, as if it knew exactly where to go. In the center of the lab, Kenny found a room filled with old computers and files. Most of the equipment was destroyed, but one terminal still had power. Kenny booted it up and accessed a folder labeled Project Sentinel. The files were staggering. Detailed reports on genetic modifications, neural implants, and behavioral programming scrolled across the screen. There were videos too, footage of animals being trained to perform impossible tasks. And then there was the dog, Unit 17. It was the first successful prototype, capable of independent thought and decision-making. Kenny's stomach turned. "They turned you into a machine," he whispered, looking at the dog. Suddenly, a noise echoed through the lab. Footsteps. Kenny turned, his heart pounding. The dog growled, its body tense. They weren't alone. The abandoned lab was silent, save for the faint hum of a flickering light. Kenny Reeves stood frozen, his eyes scanning the room for the source of the footsteps. The dog, Unit 17, positioned itself in front of him, its growl low and threatening. "Show yourself," Kenny called out, his voice steady despite the tension. From the shadows, two figures emerged. They wore tactical gear, their faces obscured by helmets. One of them spoke, his tone calm yet menacing. "Mr. Reeves, we've been looking for you. Hand over the dog, and we'll make this easy." Kenny's jaw tightened. "Not happening." The man sighed, signaling to his partner. "We don't want this to get messy." Kenny didn't wait for them to act. He grabbed a nearby metal pipe and swung it at the closest figure, forcing him to stumble back. The second man raised a taser, but the dog sprang into action. With incredible speed, it lunged at him, knocking the device from his hand and sending him crashing to the ground. The first man recovered quickly and lunged at Kenny, but Kenny sidestepped and shoved him into a crumbling desk. The dog pinned the second attacker, its teeth bared mere inches from his neck. The man froze, not daring to move. Kenny glared at the pinned attacker. "Who sent you? Sentinel Labs?" The man hesitated, then nodded. "You don't know what you've got. That dog isn't a pet. It's a weapon. You're in way over your head." Kenny gestured to the dog, and it stepped back, letting the man scramble to his feet. "Tell your bosses I'm not giving it up, and if they want to come after me, they'd better be ready." The men retreated, leaving Kenny and the dog alone in the eerie silence of the lab. Kenny exhaled sharply, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He turned to the dog, which stood calmly, as if nothing had happened. "You really are full of surprises," he said, his voice tinged with both awe and unease. He returned to the computer and scrolled through more files. Among the documents, he found a blueprint for a neural implant, the very same one described in the dog's file. The implant wasn't just for programming. It contained a failsafe, a kill switch. Kenny leaned back, his stomach churning. If Sentinel Labs activated the failsafe, the dog would be terminated instantly. The chip also emitted a tracking signal, which explained how the attackers had found them. "We need to disable it," Kenny muttered, more to himself than to the dog. Kenny called Jared, his tech-savvy friend. "Jared, I need you to walk me through how to disable a neural implant." Jared's voice crackled over the line. "That's not something you can just unplug, man. If you mess up, it could kill the dog." "Then guide me," Kenny said firmly. "I'm not letting them control it." Jared sighed but agreed. "All right, you'll need tools to cut through the collar and access the chip. Do you have anything?" Kenny rummaged through the lab and found a toolkit. Following Jared's instructions, he carefully removed the chip from the collar. The dog remained still, as if it understood the gravity of the situation. Once the chip was out, Jared guided Kenny through disabling the signal and deactivating the failsafe. That should stop the tracking," Jared said. "But Kenny, if they know the failsafe is offline, they'll come after you harder." "Let them," Kenny replied. "Thanks, Jared." With the chip deactivated, Kenny destroyed the remaining equipment in the lab, ensuring Sentinel Labs couldn't use anything left behind. As he and the dog left the building, Kenny felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. For now, they were free, but he knew Sentinel Labs wouldn't stop. The drive back to the city was quiet. Kenny and the dog were on high alert, watching for any signs of pursuit. They returned to Jared's workshop to regroup. Jared greeted them nervously. "I've been looking into Sentinel Labs since you called. These guys are bad news, Kenny. They've got resources, connections, and no problem playing dirty." Kenny nodded. "I figured as much. But what's their endgame? Why go to such lengths for this dog?" Jared gestured to his computer screen. Project Sentinel wasn't just about creating enhanced animals. It was a test run. They want to scale this up, build an army of these creatures controlled remotely. Your dog is the only one that's fully operational, and now that you've disabled the failsafe, they can't control it anymore. That makes it a liability." Kenny frowned. "So they'll keep coming. Until they get it, or destroy it," Jared said grimly. That night, Kenny prepared for the inevitable. He returned to his secluded home and fortified the property. He set up barriers, locked down the windows, and armed himself with whatever weapons he could find. The dog watched him work, its calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding them. As the night deepened, the dog suddenly stood and growled, its ears pinned back. Kenny grabbed a flashlight and peered outside. Shadows moved in the distance. "They're here," he muttered. The first attack came silently. A drone buzzed overhead, scanning the property with an infrared light. The dog barked sharply, leaping onto a stack of crates and swatting the drone out of the air. Sparks flew as it crashed to the ground. Moments later, armed operatives emerged from the darkness. Kenny fired a warning shot, but they pressed forward, their movements precise and coordinated. The dog charged into the fray, its speed and agility unmatched. It disarmed one attacker with a calculated strike to his wrist and took down another by knocking him off balance. Kenny provided cover, using the environment to his advantage. The battle was chaotic, but Kenny and the dog worked seamlessly together. The operatives, despite their training, were no match for the combination of Kenny's resourcefulness and the dog's enhanced abilities. When the dust settled, the attackers had either fled or been incapacitated. Kenny stood in the middle of the chaos, his chest heaving. The dog sat beside him, its fur matted with dirt but its eyes as sharp as ever. Kenny crouched down, placing a hand on the dog's head. "You're not just a protector," he said quietly. "You're a fighter." The dog leaned into his touch for a brief moment before returning to its watchful stance. The attack had proven one thing: Sentinel Labs wasn't going to stop. But Kenny wasn't backing down either. With the dog by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Keanu Reeves spent the following day fortifying his home further. He reinforced the doors and windows, added security cameras, and even set up makeshift traps around the perimeter. The dog, as always, shadowed him, its watchful gaze scanning for potential threats. "Who knew life would turn into one of my movies?" Kenny muttered, hammering a board into place. By the afternoon, Jared arrived at the property, his beat-up van loaded with equipment. "I couldn't just sit this one out," Jared said as he unloaded gear. "If they're coming for you again, you'll need more than a few boards and traps." Kenny clapped him on the shoulder. "Thanks, man. I could use the help." Jared set up motion sensors and a makeshift command center in Kenny's living room. "This should give us a heads up if anyone approaches, and I've got a few surprises for them if they do." As night fell, the air grew tense. Kenny, Jared, and the dog stayed inside, monitoring the cameras and sensors. The calm didn't last long. Around midnight, a faint hum broke the silence. Kenny glanced at the monitors and saw a new threat approaching. A sleek, black, panther-like creature moving with calculated precision. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its movements were almost mechanical. "Is that another one of their creations?" Jared asked, his voice shaking. Kenny's jaw tightened. "Looks like it." The dog stood by the door, growling softly. Kenny knelt beside it. "This one's different, isn't it? Stronger." The panther prowled closer, its gaze locked on the house. Kenny knew they couldn't wait for it to strike. "Jared, stay inside. I'll handle this." "Are you insane?" Jared protested, but Kenny was already moving. The dog followed him out the door without hesitation. Kenny stepped into the yard, his shotgun at the ready. The panther froze, its ears twitching. It let out a guttural growl that sent a shiver down Kenny's spine. "All right, big guy," Kenny said, leveling the shotgun. "Let's see what you've got." Before he could fire, the panther lunged with terrifying speed. Kenny barely dodged as the creature slammed into the ground where he'd been standing. The dog immediately engaged, darting around the panther and snapping at its legs. The two animals clashed in a blur of motion, their movements almost too fast to follow. The panther was larger and stronger, but the dog was faster and more strategic, constantly evading and countering. Kenny aimed for the panther's hind leg and fired. The shot grazed its side, causing it to stumble. The dog seized the opening, leaping onto the panther's back and sinking its teeth into its neck. The panther let out a furious roar, thrashing violently. The fight was brutal, but the dog's precision and resilience eventually overwhelmed the panther. With one final strike, the dog pinned the panther to the ground, forcing it into submission. As the panther lay still, Kenny approached cautiously. Its glowing eyes dimmed, and its breathing slowed. For a moment he felt a pang of pity. It wasn't the creature's fault it had been made into a weapon. Kenny placed a hand on the dog's head. "You're incredible, you know that?" The dog looked up at him, its tail wagging slightly, before returning its focus to the fallen panther. Inside the house, Jared stared at the monitors, his mouth agape. "You actually pulled it off," he said as Kenny and the dog walked back inside. Kenny nodded, his expression grim. But this was just the beginning. The next morning, Kenny interrogated the remains of the panther-like creature. Its collar, similar to the dog's, held another encrypted chip. Jared quickly got to work decoding it while Kenny and the dog kept watch. "This one's tougher to crack," Jared muttered. "They must have upgraded their encryption." Kenny sat across from him, cleaning his shotgun. "Take your time. They'll come again soon enough." Hours passed before Jared finally cracked the code. "Got it," he exclaimed, spinning his chair around. "And you're not going to believe this." Kenny leaned forward as Jared pulled up the data. The Panther wasn't just an enhanced unit. It was programmed to retrieve or terminate Unit 17 if necessary. That thing was sent specifically to hunt your dog. Kenny frowned. Why is this dog so important to them? It's more than just a prototype, isn't it? Jared scrolled through the files, his face growing pale. The data your dog carries, it's more than research. It's a key. Sentinel Labs built this entire program to create a network of controllable animals. Whoever holds this key can access and shut down every single one of their operations. Kenny's blood ran cold. So the dog isn't just a weapon, it's their Achilles heel. Jared nodded, and they'll do whatever it takes to get it back. As the weight of the revelation sank in, Kenny felt a surge of determination. Sentinel Labs wasn't just after him, they were willing to tear apart anything in their path to recover their secret. And now he had the power to bring them down. The dog sat beside him, its gaze steady and unwavering. Kenny placed a hand on its head. "You've been through a lot, haven't you? They made you into this, but you're more than what they think you are." The dog leaned into his touch, its eyes softening for the first time. That night, Kenny began planning his next move. He couldn't keep running forever, and he couldn't let Sentinel Labs continue their experiments unchecked. The files Jared had decrypted included locations of other labs and key personnel involved in the project. "This ends now," Kenny said, his voice firm. "We take the fight to them." Jared hesitated. "Kenny, you're talking about going up against an entire organization. They have resources, weapons, and operatives everywhere." "I've faced worse," Kenny replied with a faint smile. "Besides, I'm not alone." The dog barked once, as if agreeing. Kenny spent the next few hours gathering supplies and mapping out their strategy. The first target was a facility on the outskirts of the city, a central hub for Sentinel's operations. If they could take it down, it would cripple the organization. As Kenny loaded his gear into the car, Jared pulled him aside. "You know this is a one-way trip, right? They're not going to let you walk away from this." Kenny shrugged. "I stopped walking away a long time ago." Jared sighed but nodded. "All right, let's do this." The dog hopped into the passenger seat, its body tense and ready. Kenny climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. As they drove into the night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he wasn't just reacting, he was taking control. Kenny Reeves parked his car on the outskirts of the city, the distant glow of Sentinel Labs' central facility illuminating the horizon. It was a sprawling, fortified structure surrounded by high walls and patrolled by guards. The facility pulsed with energy, the hub of an organization that had wreaked havoc in its relentless pursuit of control. Beside him, the dog, Unit 17, sat poised, its sharp gaze fixed on the facility. It seemed to sense what was coming. Kenny leaned back in his seat, taking a deep breath. "All right, buddy, this is it. We're walking into the lion's den." Jared's voice crackled through Kenny's earpiece. "Kenny, I've patched into their surveillance network. I can loop some of the cameras, but you'll need to move fast. Once they realize what's happening, they'll throw everything they got at you." "Understood," Kenny replied. He turned to the dog and gave a quick nod. "Let's move." The approach to the facility was tense. Kenny and the dog slipped through the shadows, avoiding patrols and cameras. With Jared guiding them from afar, they navigated to a side entrance, a service door hidden behind crates. Inside, the air was cold and sterile. The facility buzzed with activity. Scientists moving between labs, guards stationed at key points, and the faint hum of machinery. Kenny and the dog crept through the corridors, staying out of sight. Jared's voice came through again. "The main server room is on the lower level. That's where the core data is stored. If you upload the key from Unit 17, it'll overload their systems and shut everything down." Kenny smirked. "Simple plan. Let's hope it stays that way." As they descended deeper into the facility, the resistance intensified. A pair of guards spotted them in a narrow hallway. Before Kenny could react, the dog lunged, knocking one guard unconscious with a swift strike. Kenny disarmed the other with a calculated move, leaving him dazed on the ground. "They're going to notice that," Jared warned. "You need to hurry." Kenny pushed forward, adrenaline fueling his movements. The dog stayed close, its instincts sharp and precise, guiding them through the labyrinthine corridors. Finally, they reached the server room. It was a massive chamber filled with rows of blinking servers and a central console. Kenny approached the console and pulled out the encrypted chip Jared had modified earlier. "This is it," he muttered. As he inserted the chip, alarms blared, red lights flooded the room, and an automated voice announced, "Unauthorized access detected. Security protocols engaged." "Kenny, you've got company," Jared said urgently. "They're locking down the building." The first wave of guards stormed into the room. Kenny and the dog sprang into action. Using the server racks as cover, Kenny fired precise shots, keeping the guards at bay. The dog darted between enemies, disarming them and sowing chaos. Despite the onslaught, Kenny managed to hold his ground long enough for the chip to upload its payload. The console screen flickered as the data transfer completed. "Upload successful," Jared confirmed. "You just fried their entire network." Kenny grinned. "Now we just need to get out of here." As they made their escape, the facility began to shut down. Lights flickered, machinery ground to a halt, and the chaos spread. Guards shouted orders, but without their systems, their coordination fell apart. Kenny and the dog fought their way to the surface, dodging bullets and evading capture. By the time they reached the exit, the facility was in complete disarray. Outside, Kenny turned to see the building behind them collapse into darkness. Sentinel Labs' central hub was crippled, their operations brought to a grinding halt. Kenny looked at the dog, its breathing heavy but its eyes still sharp. "We did it," he said, a rare smile crossing his face. "You're free now." The dog wagged its tail, a small but significant gesture. The next morning, Kenny and the dog drove out of the city, leaving behind the wreckage of Sentinel Labs. The open road stretched ahead, the sunlight breaking through the clouds. For the first time in weeks, Kenny felt a sense of peace. They stopped at a quiet park on the outskirts of a small town. Kenny sat on a bench, watching as the dog explored the grassy field. It moved with a freedom that hadn't been there before, no longer burdened by the weight of its programming. Jared called, his tone both relieved and cautious. "Kenny, you really did it. Sentinel Labs is finished, but you should know there are rumors. Not everyone in the organization was at that facility. Some of them might still be out there." Kenny nodded, his eyes on the dog. "Let them come. We'll be ready." As the days turned into weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. Kenny and the dog, now named Shadow, stayed on the move, never staying in one place for too long. They avoided the spotlight, keeping their distance from the world they had disrupted. One evening, while sitting by a campfire in the middle of nowhere, Kenny looked at Shadow. "You're not just some experiment," he said quietly. "You're family now." Shadow tilted its head, its intelligent eyes reflecting the firelight. For a moment, the bond between them felt unbreakable, a partnership forged in chaos but grounded in trust. Despite the peace, Kenny knew the fight wasn't over. Sentinel Labs might have been crippled, but their reach was vast. There would always be those who sought to exploit what Shadow represented. But Kenny was ready. With Shadow by his side, he felt unstoppable. As they drove off into the horizon, Shadow perked up, its ears twitching at the sound of a distant drone. Kenny glanced in the rearview mirror, a knowing smile on his face. "Looks like we got company," he said. "Let's give them a warm welcome." And with that, the unlikely duo disappeared into the night, ready to face whatever came next.